I'd like to invite you, if you want more food on your plate, to go ahead and grab some. You're welcome to eat during tonight's presentation, but I want to try to reduce distractions once the program gets started. So I'm fine with people doing that while I speak, but I just get people in motion. It is always a tremendous honor and privilege for me to launch the evening of our Scholar in Residence program. And Brian and I were speaking, and we believe this is the 8th annual Yoni Shore Memorial Scholar in Residence weekend. What I don't think any of us could have imagined when Brian and I met and dreamed up the Scholar in Residence program all these years ago was that an annual event commemorating a beloved family member who was taken from us by an act of terror in Istanbul would come full circle with another act of terror, marking and bringing in another member of the family, in this case Amir Tibon and his family, his wife and two girls as well, who were there on Nahal Oz. But this is how life is, and one of the themes, I think, of this weekend and of the book, The Gates of Gaza, is sort of just the death of illusion and the mystery, the immensity of things that we can't fully wrap our heads around, as well as this continual Jewish process of exodus after exodus, this eternal attempt to find redemption in a world that too often can break our hearts. And yet, as we'll come to hear, the Gates of Gaza is not only that. I was telling Amir the other day over lunch that when I was reading this book, which took me a very long time to read, Amir, because it was so emotionally resonant and powerful for me, and I just read it very slowly. I wept like a baby at many times, but the book reminds me of Moby Dick. And I don't know how many of you have ever read Moby Dick, but Moby Dick goes from chapters of the whaling story, this immense, unfathomable mystery, this drive that no one can fully understand of Ahab, and then it gets interrupted by the story of whaling technology, and you get to breathe a little bit and catch your breath and catch up. And the book very much does something similar, that we step out of the emotional intensity of a very difficult reality to gain perspective and memory and to understand the politics, the regional politics that led to that fateful moment on October 7th. And so there's this period, this book has periods of compression and release. Compression and release. And it seems to me that in so many ways that's what the Shore family, Tibon family, have experienced as well. Perhaps that's just what it is to be a human being. And so I want to call up Yael because she's going to share some words. Inbal could not be here this year, but she had written some statements. And each year for a few years, when Inbal hasn't been able to come, you have shared her comments, often at Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, as we continue to remember Yoni and as the importance of his life to the family doesn't really end, and he continues to be a shining light. So without any further ado, I just want to thank you very much, to the entire Shore family, for entrusting us with this program here at Neve Shalom, and for the care of your family in preserving Yoni's memory while enriching our community with these fantastic opportunities to learn and grow with our scholars in residence. So, Yael, Randy.
About 10 days ago, Erev Yom HaZikaron, the evening of Israeli memorial for those who fell in wars and terrorist attacks. Inbal, Yoni's wife, participated in the kibbutz ceremony. And here is what she said. My words are for Yoni. Yoni Shur. Yonatan in his birth certificate. Jones, as we all called him. Son of Yael and Randy, my partner, father of Goni and Uri, brother to Amir, Eyal, Eran, and Idit. A whole world. 40 years and 3 days since his birth in Portland, Oregon, until he was taken from us in Istanbul in a terror attack and was brought back to the kibbutz forever. 9 years, and still his absence is odd and surprising at all times. It took me a long time to speak of him in past tense because Yoni was so noticeable. His appearance was of many contrasting views. He was full of beauty and depth. He had much understanding about love, acceptance, and attachment. Yoni's personality and character were formed here in the kibbutz. Here was the source of bonding to the roots, to the soil of this country. He used to say that he was like a piece of driftwood in a streaming river. No rivers in Israel. But you could always find in him a sense of security. You could always find a feeling of companionship, a feeling of home. Oh, how much I miss that. Many of the people that are here in the kibbutz know Yoni from his wild youth years that were full of fire, experience, revolt, search, and doubt. Perhaps from these insights develop his understanding of a complicated world. He possesses special sensitivity and a great humanity. Yoni knew how to look at people eye to eye, to catch in one glimpse the movement of their mind, and to know how to talk with them. He knew how to say complicated concepts in simple words. He knew how to say truth, but also to speak nonsense, to say one thing and to think of its opposite and to laugh. How much he knew how to laugh. I regret that our kids were so little when Yoni left us. Goni was 9.5. Uri was almost 7. But I knew that he left a great impact on them, mainly because he knew how to love them truly. Perhaps as a heritage to Yael, a school principal, and Randy, a timeless teacher. He knew how to educate them. Now, Goni and Uri are maturing to become special people in this world. And I, Inbal, I still see Yoni's free spirit in them. In the ocean of changes, Yoni always knew how to be himself. He was blessed with a beautiful and wise soul. Yoni's loss taught me how much death pushes you into life. It taught me to find the thin glimpse of light in any terrifying situation. It taught me to be persistent and determined, to continue looking for the light even in these harsh days. On this occasion, I want to thank Randy, Yael, and the whole Shur family for showing me the power of life, for the dedication to choose life. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
Good evening, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom. Yael and I are here with our son Amir. To welcome you to the annual Scholar of Residence program in honor of our son Yoni. I want to convey our deepest appreciation and thankfulness to Barbara and Brian, Rabbi Kozak, and all the synagogue staff who helped to create this event. It's so good to see all of our friends and family who have come from a long way and have joined us this evening. We are so proud that our nephew, Amir Tibon, is the guest speaker. And here is Amir Tibon.
Shabbat Shalom. Hi, good evening. It's so good to see everyone, and it's such an honor to be here this evening, to return to Portland, to return to Neve Shalom, and to return to this incredible tradition of the Scholar in Residence Weekend in memory of Yoni, my cousin. I have to say, I'm excited to be here. And I've been doing quite a lot of speaking engagements about the situation in Israel and the war and the events of October 7 in different places. But this is special, because here I am among family and among friends and in a place that I have great memories from, because I was here when we started this great tradition with Brian a few years ago. And to come back and to see so many people come to take part in this important evening, and to hear also my perspective and story is very touching. For many, many families in Israel, the date October 7 will forever be the day that changed their lives. Because on that horrific day, October 7, 2023, we lost 1,200 people in the state of Israel, the worst day in the history of our country. Civilians who were murdered, and soldiers and police officers who were killed. And we had more than 200 people kidnapped into Gaza. And dozens of them, unfortunately, had been kidnapped alive, but later died or were murdered in captivity. It's really the day that changed everything. And I want to say that for our family, you know, I come from the Tibon branch, but the Shur family, so close to our heart. For our family, March 19 is a date that changed everything, the day that we lost Yoni in the terror attack in Istanbul. One memory that stays with me from that day, I was texting all day long with Amir, my cousin with the same name as mine, although in Hebrew it's spelled with different letters, just so you know. But I was texting all day with Amir, because I, from my work as a journalist, was trying to gather information. For many hours we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know exactly what's the situation, and we were trying to gather any clues that we could. And when I started in the afternoon to understand that things are not looking good, I took my car and I drove from my home in Kibbutz Nachal Oz on the border with Gaza, a place I'm going to speak about quite a lot over this weekend. And I made the drive to Kvutzat Schiller, to the kibbutz of the Shur family and the kibbutz where my mother grew up. It's about an hour drive. Israel is a very small country. And I remember getting there and seeing Amir, and we didn't need to exchange any words because by the look on my face and by the look on his face, we both already understood. And when I think of October 7th, for so many families on that day, including our family, by the way, there was this experience of those dreadful hours where you don't really know what's going on and you don't have answers and you don't have information. And this is something that if you listen to stories of people of October 7, you will hear this a lot, a repetition of what I just told you, those long, long hours that you are waiting for news, for information, for validation, for a miracle. And this is something that, with me, it will stay forever. And what we are doing here this weekend, and this project, in memory of Yoni, this is always the answer, to choose life and to remember and to do good things that bring people together and create a sense of community and of learning. And so this is a very, very important tradition, and I'm very proud to continue to be a part of it. What I'm going to speak about this weekend is all centered around the events of October 7. Tomorrow, we're going to have a very special panel here about survivors and how to live with this kind of word hovering above you. Somebody who survived a terrible event, a tragedy, an event where other people did not survive. And tomorrow evening, I'm going to be sharing in full detail my own family story on October 7th. And on Sunday morning, we will have a discussion about the future, about rebuilding, about what's going to happen in communities like Nachal Oz moving forward. Tonight, I want to go back a bit and speak about how we got to October 7th and a bit about history. Rabbi Kozak mentioned that in my book, The Gates of Gaza, which I published in September, basically almost a year to the October 7 attack, the book goes back and forth between the events of that day and the history that led to it. I wrote this book in English, originally, and I started writing it in December 2023, 2 months after the attack. The reason I decided to write it was because starting from October 8th already, I saw that there was a concentrated effort to deny, minimize, justify, and erase the events of October 7. It started right away. And that effort is still ongoing today, 19 months later. And a lot of money is being put into it. A lot of people are taking part in it. And I felt that my duty was to fight back against this effort, and that the best way I could do it was with my words and with my story. And I started writing what happened to me, to my family, to my neighbors, to my friends, to my community, to my country on that day. And while I was writing about the events of October 7, I realized, and specifically because I was writing it in English with a mission of telling the story to the world, I realized that I was going to have to bring people up to date with a lot of history. Because you can't really understand October 7 if you don't understand a lot of basic information about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A lot of people all over the world watch the news or watch their news feed on social media, and they develop an opinion on this war without really knowing anything where is Israel, where is Gaza, who lives here and who lives there, what is Hamas, and what are the kibbutzim on the border, and who are the different countries involved. And I realized that I have to actually bring in that history as part of the story. When I came with this concept of a book that tells of October 7, but also tells of the history that led to it, to my eventual publisher, Little Brown and Company, I had a great editor there, Alex Littlefield, and he told me in a very American way, I love this idea, but I have one condition. He said, okay, let me hear you out. And he said the historical chapters shouldn't feel like you have to eat your vegetables, which to an Israeli would be a weird statement because, you know, we do a lot of fun things with vegetables, but I understand the American concept behind it. And I said, okay, you gave me a challenge. You know, these chapters have to be as interesting, as, you know, tasteful in a way. Otherwise, people, he said, will just skip over the history and run to the drama. And I decided to write those chapters basically based on the personal stories of people from my kibbutz, from Nachal Oz, which is a small community, 450 people living half a mile from the border with Gaza, the closest Israeli community to the Gaza Strip. And I told the history of Israel and Gaza through the personal stories of people from this kibbutz, starting with the founders' generation, people who built this kibbutz in the very early days of the State of Israel. The kibbutz was founded by a group of 60 young men and women, 19 and 20-year-olds at the time, who had enlisted in the Israeli military in the early 1950s, and then received a mission, according to legend, directly from the famous General Moshe Dayan, to go and build a kibbutz directly on the border with Gaza, half a mile from the border fence, to be the closest kibbutz to Gaza. Some of those young men and women who did this, who built this kibbutz originally, they are still with us today. They're just 89 or 90, but they are still young at heart and survived, some of them, the attack of October 7, and they're still with us. And I told it through their story, then following that, the stories of other people in the community. I'll read two small segments from the book this evening that will kind of bring you into the story. The first is simply going to be the opening page and a half of the book, which takes place on October 7 at 6:29 a.m. in my house in Kibbutz Nachal Oz. The other one will be a bit more of history, but we'll start, first of all, on that morning. 6:29 a.m., October 7, 2023. At first, there was only a whistle, a short, loud shriek coming through our bedroom window, indicating the descent of a mortar from the skies above our house. I didn't wake up immediately. The noise, otherworldly but familiar, somehow blended into my dreams. Miri, my wife, was quicker to realize the danger. "Amir, wake up, a mortar," she said, elbowing me. In an instant, I was wide awake, adrenaline pumping. We both leapt out of bed and, wearing only our underwear, frantically sprinted out of our bedroom and down the hall toward the open doorway of our safe room. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. We reached the room and shut its heavy door. No sooner were we enveloped in darkness than a large explosion rocked the building. We made it just in time. That first explosion was followed by a second and a third, and then more and more. It was a barrage of mortars, a heavy, deadly rain falling all around us. "Did you hear an alarm?" I asked Miri, whispering into the void of the blacked-out room. "I just heard it about to fall. That's what woke me up," she replied. There had been no siren, nothing to warn us but the whistle. We were beginning to catch our breath, but as we did, we felt the vibration of another explosion nearby, and then another. I looked at my watch and saw that it had now been 5 minutes since we ran to the room, and the bombardment had not let up. We were surprised and disoriented, but not fearful. Certainly not panicked. Not yet. As residents of Nachal Oz, a small community of just over 400 people, located on the Israeli border with the Gaza Strip, we had experienced situations like this before. Nachal Oz, which was founded in the early 1950s, is less than a mile from the border fence, making it officially the closest Israeli community to the coastal enclave that runs along the Mediterranean. As the mortars kept falling around us, we felt safe inside the room, with its heavy door locked and its only window sealed with a solid metal plate, a simple square of iron, the exact same size as the window that was attached to the wall. With the door closed and the plate covering the window, it was pitch black inside the room. But we used our phones for light and settled onto the floor to wait out the bombardment. As soon as we had done so, however, we read on our phones that Hamas, the Palestinian terror group controlling Gaza, had not just attacked our community, but also fired mortars and rockets at dozens of other places across Israel. We hoped that our 2 daughters, sleeping in the room, would continue to sleep peacefully in their beds for a little longer. But for us, the night was over. We had to start packing. This is, of course, before other events that I will discuss tomorrow. But just to bring you a bit into the story and into the moment of those minutes on the morning of October 7, before the whole world went upside down. When we speak about October 7, it's important, like I said, to understand that it's not a day that stands alone in history. It's a day that, in a way, is the most terrible one of a longer history of conflict that we've had between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the wider Arab world, specifically Israel and Gaza. And this conflict has shaped many things in Israel, and specifically the place where I chose to live, Kibbutz Nachal Oz, for many years. And in the second chapter of the book, I go back to the origins of the story of Nachal Oz and of Gaza. What is even the Gaza Strip? How many people here would know, for example, how it was created? Short lesson in history, if I may. More than 100 years before October 7, in 1907, the British Empire reached an agreement with the Ottoman Empire to mark a border between the territories that they controlled in the Middle East. The land that the Turks and the Brits called Palestine, and we call Eretz Israel, was under Ottoman control, and Egypt was controlled by Great Britain. So they drew a line that would be a border. It started in the southern tip of Palestine, as they call it, the city of Eilat today, and it ran along the desert all the way to the city of Rafah, which is on the southwestern Mediterranean coast. Everything north of it was under the Turkish control. Everything south of it was under British control. 10 years later, the British Empire took over everything to the north of that border, and they created the British Mandate for Palestine. They took over Jaffa and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, and they took also over the different cities in the Gaza area, Gaza and Khan Yunis and Rafah. All of it was now under British control. Cairo, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. But for a very bureaucratic, not really important reason, the Brits decided to keep the border between Egypt and Palestine running from Rafah to Eilat. And that's how the city of Rafah became the southwestern edge of the British Mandate of Palestine, a border city between Egypt and Palestine. 30 years after that, in 1947, we had our War of Independence that led to the creation of the State of Israel. And I don't need to teach you all the history in between of the Zionist movement and how we try to have our own country and everything that happened. But eventually, at the end of that war, the war ended in January 1949, a strange situation emerged. Israel took over most of the Mediterranean coast, running from Rosh HaNikara near the Lebanese border, through Haifa and Jaffa and Ashdod and Ashkelon, but we did not take over Gaza. Israel deliberately chose not to take over Gaza, which was a large Palestinian city on the coast, and it became the area that all the refugees, the Palestinian refugees from the other coastal towns, centered in. Gaza, on the eve of our War of Independence, was home to about 80,000 people, and at the end of the war, it was home to 300,000 people. So more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees arrived there. And Gaza was taken over by the Egyptians as part of the post-war arrangements. And it would have been very natural to erase the old border between Egypt and Palestine and basically turn that entire enclave that was artificially created from Gaza at the north of it to Rafah in the south of it into Egyptian territory. But the Egyptians, just like the Israelis, said, no, we don't really want to be responsible for this place. We can temporarily manage it as part of the post-war arrangements, but we're going to keep the border. And that's how the Gaza Strip was created. The Gaza Strip was basically the area where the Israeli military stopped in 1948, the places that we didn't decide to conquer on the Mediterranean. From those places all the way to Rafah, where the Egyptians said, this is where our country begins and ends. That's the Gaza Strip. And almost 80 years later, it's still a problem that nobody wants to manage. If you follow the news today, okay, 2025, there is a huge debate in Israel about whether or not we should fully occupy Gaza as part of the ongoing war. And a lot of people are asking, well, if we do that, what happens next? Who is going to be responsible for everything that happens there? And a lot of Israelis would like the Egyptians to take over Gaza, and the Egyptians don't want to do that. The biggest difference is that back then it was home to 300,000 people, and today it's home to more than 2 million people. Another huge difference is that today, after October 7 and the war, large parts of Gaza are completely destroyed. And if in 1948 you had more than 200,000 refugees in Gaza, all of them people who lost their homes in the war of 1948, today in Gaza you have more than 1.5 million refugees. People who lost their homes in the current war after October 7. And you see that history has a tendency to repeat itself, not necessarily in a good way. Kibbutz Nachal Oz was founded in the early 1950s because back then the border with Gaza was considered one of Israel's most unstable and most dangerous borders. Remember, this is just a few years after the war of 1948. Most of the people who live in Gaza are refugees from that war, who had lost their homes or their property in what is now the state of Israel. And many of them want to take it back. And there are all kinds of organizations beginning to be created there. And there are attacks across the border. And that's when General Moshe Dayan gives that young group, those 19 and 20-year-olds, half of them men, half of them women, right? Think about a bunch of American college kids, basically, in terms of the age group, the mission to go and build a kibbutz on this border and be part of its protection. And they come there, and they build it, and it was officially announced as, you know, it took them a while, but it was officially announced as a kibbutz in the first week of October 1953. Which is why on October 7, 2023, and I will talk about that tomorrow, but on that day we were preparing to celebrate 70 years to Kibbutz Nahal Oz. It was supposed to be a huge party. It was supposed to take place at 7 p.m. at the communal pool. 70 years of Zionist steadfastness on the border. Instead of a celebration, of course, we had something very different. And that's often like that in life, that tragedy hits us sometimes at moments when we are preparing to celebrate. Okay, you know, when we talk about our family's tragedy with Yoni, you know, Yoni was celebrating his birthday. You know, like Yael said, you know, in terms of the distance of the years and the days. In the history of Nahal Oz, there is another very, very famous event, perhaps before October 7, the most famous in the history of the kibbutz, that has this combination of a celebration and a tragedy. And it's an event from the very early years of the kibbutz, from April 1956. And I'll tell you the story, and I'll read a few parts from the book, and you'll understand how relevant it is for today. So it's April 29, 1956. 3 years after Kibbutz Nahal Oz has been founded on the border with Gaza, half a mile from the border. By then, the population has grown from 60 to about 100, so it's a very small community. It's all young people. The oldest person in the kibbutz is 23 years old. They're doing agriculture. They're working the fields. They're building homes. They're building a kindergarten. They're protecting the border. They're doing, you know, patrols during the day and the night. They want to keep the new organizations that are being formed in Gaza from attacking the communities more inside Israel. A month before this day, April 29, a month before, in March of 1956, an American journalist that some people here probably you know, have heard the name, comes to do a segment about Nahal Oz for CBS News. It's actually a quote from it that I chose to open the book with, that really kind of, you know, shows the nature of it. It's Edward Morrow coming to Nahal Oz and doing a story, and he talks about the young people protecting the border. And a month after his visit, April 29, it's supposed to be a day with 4 weddings taking place in the kibbutz. Back then, you didn't have your own wedding at the date that you chose. You know, today the kibbutzim are different. When Miri and I got married in Nahal Oz in 2016, we had our own wedding, a small Israeli wedding with 450 guests at the local pool. But back then it was different. If you wanted to get married, you had to, you know, kind of sign up. And when there were enough couples signed up, the kibbutz would do one big event for everybody. Of course, it saves budget. So on that day, April 29, there are supposed to be 4 weddings in the young kibbutz. And one of the couples, that among the 4, decides to invite to the wedding the chief of staff of the Israeli military, General Dayan, who, of course, gave at the time the order to build this kibbutz, and now he's the top general of the country. And surprisingly, a few days before the wedding, his office sends a letter announcing that he will arrive to the kibbutz to take part in the celebration. So in the early morning, there is a rehearsal ahead of the big event. There are going to be hundreds of guests, you know, the families of the 4 couples are coming, and some important people. And there is a rehearsal for a dance and a song that they're going to do together. And while this is taking place inside the kibbutz, the young security chief of the community, a man named Ro'i Rutberg, 22 years old, one of the founding group of the kibbutz, he receives information that there is a border infiltration south of Nahal Oz. And he gets on his horse with his rifle, and he tries to go and see there what's going on. And when he gets to this point in the fields of the kibbutz, it turns out that there is indeed a small infiltration by several women, Palestinian women from Gaza, but it's an ambush that was set up especially for him by the Egyptian military. And Egyptian soldiers fire at him from the other side of the border, they kill him, and they take his body into Gaza. And his horse returns to the kibbutz with no rider on it. And that's when people begin to realize that something bad happened. And this is while everybody is preparing for the big celebration, for the wedding. So they start searching for him, and they understand pretty much what happened. Now remember, this is 1956, there's no cell phones. You know, you can't communicate with people when they're on the road. So over the next few hours, all the guests begin to arrive for the wedding, including General Dayan. And when they arrive to the small kibbutz, they learn that instead of coming to a celebration, they have just arrived at the scene of a tragedy. And Dayan, from the small security office in the kibbutz, which was Ro'i Rutberg's office, begins to coordinate with the UN and the Egyptians the return of his body. And after a few very, very stressful hours, his body is returned to Israel. And everybody realizes that there's not going to be a wedding celebration, but the next day, for the first time in the history of this young community, full of very young people, there is going to be a funeral. Dayan tells the 4 couples, there's not going to be a party tonight, but I'm sending you, I'm giving you an order to go to a rabbi in a town a few minutes more into Israel and get halachically married today. Because he said you don't cancel a chuppah. So no party, but you're going to wear your fine wedding clothes and you're going to register with the rabbi. And then he tells them, I will come back tomorrow for the funeral. And overnight, these young kibbutzniks, again, the oldest person in the community is 23, they have to choose a place for a cemetery because they were young and strong and fulfilling the Zionist dream. And of course, they were never going to die, right? Because young people don't think they are ever going to die. This is part of the characteristics of humanity. So they did not choose a place for a cemetery. You know, they were building a kindergarten because they were expecting kids in the community. Nobody thought they would need a cemetery. But they choose a little hill overlooking the kibbutz and overlooking Gaza. And from, on a day with a good, clear weather, you can see the Mediterranean from there. So they choose this little hill to be the cemetery. And the next day, hundreds of people come to Ro'i Rutberg's funeral. And Moshe Dayan arrives, and he gives a speech there, which became one of the most iconic, famous speeches in the history of Zionism, really. I'll read a few passages from it. It's the Nahal Oz speech of Moshe Dayan. Early yesterday morning, Ro'i was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning dazzled him, and he did not see those waiting in ambush at the edge of the furrow. And here comes what is a very interesting and I would say provocative part of the speech, that today in some schools in Israel, if a teacher read this passage, they would be fired. Dayan says, "Let us not cast the blame on the murderers. Why should we question their burning hatred for us? For 8 years, since 1948, for 8 years, they have been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes, we have been transforming the lands and the villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate." Quite a statement. From the top general of the Israeli military, he basically says, we should not blame the Arabs on the other side of the border for murdering Ro'i and stealing his body. How can we blame them when they sit in those refugee camps and we see what we've been doing on the other side? All these lands that used to belong to them are now ours, and we're building homes and communities. And this is a very interesting part of the speech where Dayan basically recognizes, in very simple and short words, because that was the way he spoke, the Palestinian narrative about the 1948 war. What we call our war of independence, they call the Nakba, their disaster. And you could almost think that from this recognition of their disaster, he would make an appeal for peace. And right, because if you can already understand the other side's narrative, you're halfway through. But Dayan instead does something different. And he says, "It is not among the Arabs in Gaza, but in our own midst that we must seek Ro'i's blood. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see in all its brutality the destiny of our generation? Have we forgotten that this group of young people dwelling at Nahal Oz is bearing the heavy gates of Gaza on its shoulders? Beyond the furrow of the border, a sea of hatred and desire for revenge is swelling, awaiting the day when serenity will dull our path. This is the fate of our generation. This is our life's choice, to be prepared and armed, strong and determined, lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down." The young Ro'i who left Tel Aviv to build his home at the gates of Gaza, to be a wall for us, was blinded by the light in his heart, and he did not see the flash of the sword. The yearning for peace deafened his ears, and he did not hear the voice of murder awaiting in ambush. The gates of Gaza weighed too heavily on his shoulders and overcame him. So what Dayan does in the speech, basically, he opens up by recognizing the suffering and the tragedy of the other side, and then uses that to make an argument that there will never be peace. Right? He says their desire for revenge, their hatred will always be cast above us. And he almost blames the young people of Kibbutz Nahal Oz that he sent to live there for the murder of their friend. He basically said, you have been blinded by your desire for peace. You didn't see what was happening, and that's the result. Now, this speech immediately became, like I said, an iconic speech. In Israel, the next day it was printed in the newspapers, and Dayan was asked to come and record it on Army radio. Interesting, and I write about this in the book, interesting to note that in the recording in Army radio, one paragraph is missing. The first paragraph, where he talks about not blaming the Palestinians because they're, how can we blame them after what we did to them in 48? That paragraph was erased from the recorded version on Army radio. The young people who stood at the cemetery and buried their friend on that day, and I interviewed several of them for the book, they hated that speech. Because what did Dayan basically tell them in that speech? He told them, you guys came to live here, and you should know there is never going to be peace on this border. Because there is a very, very fundamental disagreement about the events of 1948 between us and the people on the other side, and therefore they will always want to take revenge, and you should always be armed and prepared, or things like this will happen. And they hated that speech, because these people, really the epitome of Zionism, okay? The pioneers who went to live on the border and to build a kibbutz there and to take on the danger, they believed more than anyone, I would argue, in the importance of protecting the state of Israel and serving. But they also wanted to believe that one day, maybe in a distant future, but one day, we will live in peace. And this will be a peaceful border. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that from that day, a debate has opened up between Dayan and the young kibbutzniks who listened to the speech, and while the whole country was swept in excitement about it, they wish he never said it. And Dayan himself, I should note, 21 years later, was one of the politicians who pushed for the Israeli peace agreement with Egypt. An agreement that, as part of it, Israel basically said, okay, we are not going to keep the Sinai Peninsula, which is huge territory, many times larger than the small Gaza Strip. So you could argue Dayan himself changed some of his perspective. And in the book, I talk about the ups and downs, and I write about, for example, an event in the 1990s during the Oslo years when there was a peace festival in Kibbutz Nachal Oz with the people from Gaza. You had buses coming from Gaza with hundreds of people coming to the kibbutz for a peace festival. And, there's a video of it that I found when I was working on the book. I wasn't aware of this event. And then you have October 7th. And the verdict is still out in this ongoing debate. It's really a debate about Israel, you can argue. Can this country live in peace with its neighbors? Or are we always going to have to fight, and like Dayan said, always be prepared for the worst? It's an ongoing, open question. I think for a lot of people, October 7 was an argument in favor of the Dayan speech version of Israel. On the other hand, we're seeing now that there is talk about Israel maybe having a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, the most important Arab country, and the country that is considered the historical kind of homeland of an entire religion, of Islam. And there is an opportunity, we're hearing from President Trump and his people, that there is an opportunity to make peace with Saudi Arabia. And it requires, among other things, to end the war in Gaza and to withdraw the IDF from inside Gaza, something we've done several times before, and I write about that in the book as well. And giving up on such an agreement, such a historical opportunity, could also come with a price. So this debate that started in the cemetery of Nachal Oz on April 30, 1956, it's still ongoing, and we're still living history today. The last thing I want to say before I will open it up to questions is that as we talk about these big historical events and ask ourselves the larger questions, for me and for the people of Nachal Oz, the most urgent issue, the most important issue, and the issue that has to be dealt with immediately before anything else, is the issue of our hostages. In the story of Roy Ruthberg, I told you that his body was kidnapped into Egyptian-controlled Gaza, and Dayan personally handled the negotiations and managed, after a few hours, to secure his return so he could be buried. Generally speaking, this was always something that was a priority for Israel. In the War of 1948, our War of Independence, we had hundreds of prisoners of war, and the last of them was returned to Israel after 8 months. The women were all returned within weeks, and the last of the men were returned to us after 8 months. Today, in Gaza, we have 59 hostages who have been held there by a terrorist organization for 19 months. As an Israeli, I consider it the biggest failure in the history of the state of Israel. That Jews, and also non-Jews, by the way, Arab citizens and workers from other countries, and so many people are being held by the enemy for so many months. And the majority of them are civilians, not soldiers. We also have several soldiers there. One of them, an American citizen, Idan Alexander, who made Aliyah to be a lone soldier in the IDF. I think one of the most Zionist actions that a person can do, give up, the expected route of a young American man of going to college and starting his career, and instead going to enlist as a combat soldier in the IDF. And among those 59, we have more than 20 who we know for certain are alive, and one of them is a friend of mine, Omri Miran, a neighbor, a friend, a father of 2 young girls about the same age as my girls. They were together in Gan. And our most urgent mission and priority is to bring him back alive. Not to bring back, but to bring back alive to his family. And that's why we as a community are calling to end the war as part of a deal to return all the hostages. This has been our position for quite a while now. We lost many, many people in our kibbutz on October 7, and I'll talk about it more tomorrow. But the history I just talked about is also something that is relevant to this discussion, and we can even go further back to the Bible, to the days of the Bible. If you read about Gaza in the Bible, you will know that we fought many, many, many wars with the Philistines in Gaza. The gates of Gaza that Dayan mentioned in the speech, it's actually a reference to the biblical story of Samson, who held the gates of the city of Gaza on his shoulders. And those wars, they would have a tendency to end, and there would be a period of quiet, and then there would be another one. Our approach today is we have to bring back our people from captivity after so many months. We have to bring Omri back to his girls, and we have to bring Idan Alexander back to his parents in New Jersey. And history teaches us that we will probably have more opportunities, sadly, to fight our enemies in Gaza. But right now we have to save lives, and that's the most important thing. I will end here and give everyone a few minutes to kind of digest all the information that I mentioned. There's a lot to take in. And then if people want to ask questions, I'll be happy to answer. So thank you for listening. So happy to take questions. I will say, and I also said this the last time I was in Portland, because it's my rule everywhere, that for me, a question is 1 or 2 sentences with a question mark at the end. Anything longer than that, is not a question, so I don't promise to answer. And I think the rabbi wants to take control of the question distribution. So let's give him a second to get prepared with a microphone. Well, 1 minute, he says, okay. And I see Brian and Brian are solving this behind the scenes as we speak.
Test, test.
Okay, we got it. Let's do it. So raise your hand if you have a question.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your talk. Don't you think that Israeli politicians like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Bibi, to the extent that he's influenced by them, are echoing what you said Diane's position was, that there will be no peace, and therefore, how can we get the hostages out if these people are in control?
So I think they maybe would like to think of themselves in the footsteps of Dayan. I would argue that they actually are in the footsteps of Moshe Dayan, but not in the way they would like to think of it, because Dayan, this speech is very much affiliated with his memory in Israel, but it's overshadowed by something else. Dayan is one of the key, I don't know what's the word even to use, but the people who failed in the most miserable, terrible way in the Yom Kippur War. And most Israelis, this at the end of the day is what they remember today from him. There's other things to remember, the Nachal Oz speech, the 6-day war, a lot of brave achievements as a general and as a soldier, but all of that is overshadowed by his massive failure as the defense minister in 1973, in October of 1973. And I believe that many years from today, when we will speak about these people, Netanyahu and Smotrich, we will remember them not for anything else, but mostly for October 7, 2023. And one big difference, though, is that the government of Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, after the shock and the failure, managed to get its act together and to turn it around, and within 20 days, the war was over. 20 days. 20 days later, the IDF was pushing forward in Syria and pushing forward in Egypt. Sharon, as the general that was a bit of a rebel to the army command, led the incursion over the line of the Suez, and within 20 days, the war was over. And within half a year, or maybe a little more than half a year, but we're talking in single-digit months, all the prisoners of war from Syria and Egypt had returned. So 20 days of fighting and then a few months of negotiation, and all the prisoners of war are back. With this government, we are about to enter 20 months of fighting and 20 months of the hostages not being with their families. And Moshe Dayan would not have allowed that. This is not what he did. He and Golda and the other failed leaders of 1973, they still had much more responsibility after what happened, and they managed to turn it around in a much quicker way.
So Prime Minister Netanyahu speaks of total victory, even over prioritizing the return of the hostages. So what do you think he really means by that, and is it even remotely achievable?
Yeah, I don't know what that phrase means, honestly. I don't understand what it means. All I know is that we are almost 20 months into the war. We still have hostages in Gaza. We still have soldiers dying in Gaza. We lost 2 of them just yesterday. Yesterday, or was it today? I don't even remember. I think it was today. A missile from Yemen sent 1 million Israelis to their bomb shelters, including my family. I don't know what the word total victory means. To me, victory in the war, not total, because again, I don't know what that means. Victory in the war is the following thing. A year from today, the kindergarten in Kibbutz Nachal Oz is fully operating and new families are joining the kibbutz and putting their kids in the kindergarten. This is what I define as victory in the war. I've defined it from week one. When people ask me on the first week of the war, how do we win this? I said, listen, I'm not a military strategist. I don't know how we win this. I'll tell you what the winning image is. What is the victory image? That at the end of this war, or a few months later, because it takes a little time, but at the end of it, Kibbutz Nachal Oz and Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Nir Oz and Kibbutz Kfar Aza are all accepting new families and new children. This is the victory in the war. Does an eternal war, yeah, this is worthy of, I agree, not for me, for the people of these communities. Now, does the prolonging of the war indefinitely lead us closer to this goal? No, because what is happening is that these communities are left in their current state, families are not coming back. This is not good. Will the return of the hostages lead us closer to this goal? Absolutely yes, because bringing back the hostages from these communities will give the strongest boost to the people. And it will send a signal to the people of Israel that if you decide to be a Zionist who goes to live on the border, and you are willing to live half a mile from Gaza, and you are taking some danger in doing it, your government will not abandon you. And this is an important thing. There are many other things that have to be fixed. The IDF, the military, has to convince people that what happened on October 7 cannot happen again. Not that there's not going to be an enemy, not that there are not going to be people who want to kill us. We live in the Middle East, okay? There are always going to be people who will want to kill us. But that the military will not break down at such a level that terrorists will go from home to home massacring people and the army will only arrive after many hours. This is also something that has to be fixed. But the beginning of the correction that we need in Israel is bringing the hostages back. This is the beginning of fixing the lack of trust that so many people feel today with the institutions. Yes. Or no, I should leave the...
Hi.
Oh, okay, Rabbi decides over there. Sorry.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm curious whether the events of October 7th and the aftermath, including the response from the government and what's happened with our hostages, has changed your sense of your own kind of identity as an Israeli or your identity as a Zionist and kind of your relationship to Israel?
That's a very important question. I feel that October 7 only further proved the necessity of border communities like Nachal Oz, and it, if anything, made me more Zionist in that sense. But it's true that there is a huge disappointment with this government that failed on October 7 and has been failing every day since October 7, with the hostages, with the rebuilding of the border communities, and with the management of the war. We've never had a war in Israel's history that was as long as this one. So that's a big problem, because there's a disconnect between the amazing things that we saw people all over Israel do in the aftermath of October 7 and the way Israeli society came together and people volunteered to do incredible things for the recovery of the border communities in the south and in the north, and there's this spirit of great optimism that you can feel if you, I don't know how many people here have visited Israel since October 7. Okay, so there's this spirit that you can feel of great involvement and volunteering and doing good deeds and supporting one another. And then there is the government, which is like on the opposite side of it. And that's a big, big problem but it's a problem that can be fixed, hopefully.
So I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions.
Great presentation, thank you. Do you think that the Kamala Harris administration would have brought an end to the war and the hostages faster than the Trump administration?
That's a what-if question that's difficult to ask. I think Trump actually has unique leverage if he wants to force a deal to return the hostages, because Trump is much more popular in Israel than Netanyahu is. No, that's true. That's true. He's much more popular in Israel. Listen, Israelis, I want to say something about the Israelis don't follow the American news cycle to the same level that Americans do. By the way, Americans who care deeply about Israel don't necessarily follow the Israeli news cycle as much as Israelis who live there. That's just a reality of life. Everybody is more focused on their own country's problems. So if you don't like things that President Trump is doing here in the United States, I'm not going to get involved in that, but I can tell you most Israelis not necessarily aware of it, because we have our own country. And, you know, when President Trump came in, you immediately had that first January 2025 ceasefire hostage deal, which was immensely supported by most Israelis. And most Israelis blame Netanyahu for that ceasefire not continuing into phase 2 and the return of the hostages. Okay? Now, would Kamala Harris have the same kind of leverage over Netanyahu, being someone who is not perceived by Israelis in the same way as Trump because of the history of what he did in his first term, right? He moved the embassy and he recognized the Golan. I don't know, and that's a difficult question. On the other hand, maybe she would have been more committed to it, because one of the things we feel with President Trump is that in the beginning he was very committed to this issue of the hostages, and he took a lot of pride in the return of those 33 hostages, out of them 25 alive in phase 1, and then he kind of, you know, got more interested in other things, okay? I mean, he's the President of the United States, there's a lot going on, I don't blame him. But I think one of the challenges is to see if you can get him committed to the remaining hostages with the same level of intensity. Because if that happened, I believe he would be in a unique position to force a deal on this. My fear, but this is my personal opinion, is that he's listening too much to Netanyahu and Ron Dermer. And I hope other people around him, like Mr. Witkoff, his special envoy, and others, will push in a direction that is more in line with what 70% of the people of Israel want, according to all the recent polling, which is first and foremost to bring back the hostages.
Thank you for that excellent, excellent presentation. I'm sure your book is amazing. I hope you have water up there. For those of us who were so shocked by October 7th and did a deeper dive into why security failed so horrifically, because we think of Israel as the top in the world as far as security, and those of us, meaning myself, looked into, other than the mainstream news, other people's opinions, including Israelis, Israeli military, some furious Israeli soldiers who said that cockroaches could have walked, you know, along where the alarms, you know, normally go on. So, yes, I am. And so I'm wondering what your opinion is about what failed that and how that occurred.
Yeah. Okay.